Hello, this is Dr. Stephen Greer, and this is Conversations with Dr. Greer on the World Puja Radio Network. And I'd like to thank the folks at the World Puja Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks to bring you information and special guests. And I'm really pleased today to have with me David Wilcock, who has been involved in some of the work we've been doing for many years. He actually came to the Disclosure Project National Press Club event back in 2001, coming up on the 12th year anniversary of that event. And he's going to be here to talk with me about higher concepts and consciousness and transformation and where we're headed as a civilization over the coming years and decades ahead. So thank you, David, for being on the show today.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, well, tell the audience a little bit about how you got involved in all this, because I think some people don't know the backstory of how we met and when and all of that. And
well, I came to the closed executive summary briefing for VIPs and members of Congress, which was on May 10th, 2001. I wish I could have been at the one in the National Press Club on May 9th. And you and I talked about how if you could ever dig up that video footage of that event, that would be awesome. Because, like, for one, Sergeant Clifford Stone went way farther in that meeting than he did in front of the National Press Club.
Right. Yeah, they all had more time, right.
Yeah, and the vibe was amazing because here we are in this room with people who are either congressmen or their aides, and of course I was not educated enough to know who was who, but I knew there were some heavy players in that room.
Right.
I sat right behind Helen Thomas, who was the doyen of the Western media, more or less.
Right.
And I mean, you were on fire. The vibe was electric. There were 39 witnesses in the room coming forward, didn't know if they'd even live to see the next day. And they were speaking. They were brave, and it was an amazing. The vibes were just wonderful.
Right. And that sort of continued the process we started in 1995 when we had the first gathering, although it was closed at the Asilomar out there in California where you are.
Right.
Near Monterey, and a lot of people don't even know this event happened. The people who filmed it and recorded that meeting stole all the footage. One of the problems we've had, so that everyone knows, is that because I don't know how to operate cameras and audio stuff very well, this has often been outsourced, and then the tapes disappear. And I'm embarrassed to say that this has happened too many times. But the Asilomar meeting in 1995 was an amazing event because we had cosmonauts, we had colonels from the KGB, we had, of course, Edgar Mitchell there, we had many other people who subsequently had passed away, who were, and it was the first little gathering. It wasn't a great big one like that. I think maybe we had, maybe 15 people from the military and intelligence services. And, of course, then 2 years later, we did the briefings for Congress that were closed meetings where we had a dozen or so of these folks and, of course, chairpeople of committees were there from the House and the Senate and the President and Vice President's office as well as the Pentagon. And it was at that meeting where, some of the folks who had knowledge of the false flag operation where they would begin to roll out hoaxed information about an alleged alien attack on the planet were there who at midnight or after the night before that briefing were spirited away into a secure facility out in Virginia so they couldn't testify that night in front of members of Congress. And I don't know if you even know that story, David, but it was an amazing drama that took place at the Westin Hotel there in Georgetown.
Oh, I have not heard that story. It sounds, that kind of witness sounds like the guy A.H. in your book Disclosure.
No, A.H. and I are still very much in touch. This other person he hasn't vanished. We've stayed in touch, but he essentially was threatened by the people he had worked with in a compartmented operation and told, look, do not talk about this, because he had been on an interagency committee with also some corporate folks where they had planned to use the man-made looking UFOs that Lockheed Martin and my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman, have made that are anti-gravity vehicles, which, of course, have been fully operational since the 50s, as well as a number of other false flag decoy operations, little things that look like aliens that aren't, that are man-made, et cetera, and so on. And that, this guy was basically saying that when he was on this interagency committee in 1974, that everything was set up so they could hit a button and they could make something that would be 10 times scarier than anything we've ever seen take place, and it would be 100% man-made, but it would convince almost everyone on Earth, including people in the National Military Command Center, that it was some sort of an ET invasion attack. And that they...
How does it make you feel to hear this stuff? I mean...
Well, the first time I heard it, I thought this is, excuse the expression, batshit crazy. I didn't believe it.
Right.
And then I heard it from that guy, and then I heard it from another person who didn't know that guy, and then I heard it from half a dozen others. And, what I discovered over the years is that 90% or more of the information out on the public airwaves, on the History Channel or on the Internet or in movies that deal with the UFO subject, is all concocted scare tactic propaganda that's been trying to build people to go from, the Cold War to terrorism to now asteroids, as Wernher von Braun predicted and Carol Rosin predicted, and now to this sort of this brave new world of there being a threat from the aliens, which of course is just nonsense. But what's interesting is the degree to which this had been planned and thought through over 40 years ago.
Yeah, and movies are advertising. I've often likened it to the idea that if you just are standing there and all of a sudden there's a sword through your chest and you're dying, you don't have time to be scared. You're just like, oh my God. And that's
well, yeah, that's right. That's the first time I heard this stuff. Actually, to be honest with you, the first time I heard this information, I really didn't believe it, because when I first started out on this subject in 1990, I'd written to folks like Bud Hopkins and others,
right.
And I took everything at face value, that those accounts were what they appeared to be, until I had people who came forward. This one man who lived out in Colorado had been, back in the early days, before they had perfected these weird robotic-looking things like you see in Stan Romanek's video that I've seen, that are man-made. They had this guy had been on one of these anti-grav devices with a chemical warfare agent team that were doing abductions, and he said what we did, and he was a really short guy. He was like 4 feet something, and they did excellent, what he called stagecraft, to make him look like an ET. And they would do these things. And he says, you wouldn't believe how many people who are in the political and military system and corporate system and other people in the public we've done, so that we could move their stories through the UFO investigations, abduction subcrowd, so that would become the narrative about ETs and UFOs. And he says this was all being done decades ago. And, of course, when I heard that from one guy, these are all very credible military guys, I'm going, oh, come on. The first time I thought, come on. And, one guy said, you can never tell this story, Dr. Greer, because if you do, no one will believe it. And the people who have been at that level of clearance will be killed if they come forward and get named, because it's much more sensitive stuff than Sergeant Stone or others have come forward. Or,
yeah, and as you know, Stephen, virtually every ET contactee report prior to Betty and Barney Hill, whatever it was, 1962-63, virtually every contact report prior to that time was of human-looking extraterrestrials who were totally benevolent, not Greys.
Of course, yeah. Well, I know the facility where they've been making these things. And,
right, so it's like the technology wasn't available until the 60s, and prior to that time, the only contact reports were the real ones where people were getting the good guys. Right.
Yeah. Right, and you're so correct, and it's interesting because we went from the one era into this other, and the turning point, I think, is in this CIA document from 1953, before any of us were born, even me, and I'm about to have my 6th grandchild, believe it or not. A scary thought to most people. Geez, what a guy to have as a grandfather, huh? But the thing is that in 1953, the agency, the CIA, has a document that I acquired after I briefed the CIA director that talks about I'm quoting, the psychological warfare value of the UFO subject, and in this same document, engaging Disney Studios and other big studios to make cartoons and movies about the subject for their psychological warfare value. Well, that's 60 years ago now, David.
Well, Stephen, as soon as you start saying this stuff, here's what's going to happen for some people. Right now, they're feeling sick. Their stomach is dropping. Their blood pressure is dropping. They're feeling dizzy.
Oh, I'm
sorry. They're starting to hate you. They're going to start to hate me. I'm not saying that you should be sorry, but let's acknowledge that there's a percentage of our audience that has what we would call in psychology a dissociative response when they start hearing this stuff, because they can't handle the idea of what you and I both know is called vertical integration, meaning you have corporations, military, government, finance, and media that has a cabal of interlocking directorates.
Absolutely.
But that's how this whole game is played, and people need to understand that entertainment is not random. And I'm sorry if it makes you feel sick and like you don't want to listen anymore and you're feeling really tired, like you have to close your eyes, but that's what they programmed you to do when you start hearing this stuff.
Right, exactly.
You feel anxious, you feel sweaty, you don't like it, you say, well, these guys are crazy, they must be criminals, they can't be telling me the truth, they're doing this just for the money, because they can't get into, you have to remake your worldview. I mean, you and I, we've been doing this for so long, you even longer than me, because you've been into it since the 90s, early 90s.
Well, no, I had my first contact experience with the ETs when I was about 8 or 9, so that was in 1963 or 4.
Wow.
So, it's been, for me, about 50 years that I've been involved on some personal level.
Yeah, I was born in 73 and had UFO dreams ever since I could remember, like 2 years old, so.
Yeah, that's cool, because, we can get into that in a minute, into the science of consciousness, which is, I know, a love that you and I both have. And, of course, This is the show to talk on it, because we're on the World Puja Network, where everyone listening understands the science of consciousness, the non-locality of mind, and the omnipresent nature of consciousness. And
kind of a big deal for you and me to speak at the same time. You were the only guy out there that had insiders in the 90s, more than one or two. I mean, there were a couple people who, wrote a book about that colorful UFO sighting, and I forget. But most of the other authors out there really didn't have the real deal insiders. And then you showed up in the mid-90s when I became aware of you on Art Bell, and I said, my God, this guy's got it together. You're briefing acting CIA directors, you're talking to people at very senior levels of government, people, Podesta and the Clinton administration. I hope that's okay to say on the air. Oops.
Sure. No problem. Okay. Yeah. I mean, Podesta went on the record publicly in favor of disclosure, and of course, it's well known that I briefed the CIA director, although Woolsey subsequently tried to cover up in a clumsy attempt. I always say to people, that it came up recently when I was on the Joe Rogan show a week or two ago, and people say, that Woolsey put this thing out. I said, yes, and I have a letter from his point of contact to me setting up the briefing, and of course the cover story was a dinner meeting, and they tried to make it like that wasn't the purpose of the meeting at all, when of course it was, and we have the proof of it. And I said, look, you're dealing with Washington and lawyers and politicians, and I know this sounds cynical, but I tell people, how do you know they're lying? Their lips are moving. So I know that's an outrageous thing to say. It just happens to be a true thing to say. But
well, I think people are getting it now.
I mean, they are.
It's interesting that I say we colloquially because I was just an admirer of the work back then, but I did show up at your event, and it very much felt like a team and that we were all working for the same goal. We all knew that being in that room could get us killed. And we all took the same risks in some ways. And then you got washed out by September 11th, just a few months later.
Yeah,
the momentum for disclosure was building. Everybody was starting. I mean, you had the world's media in that room. I was there when when Sergeant Clifford Stone broke down in tears describing extraterrestrial crash retrievals. The whole frickin' room leapt to their feet, and these are congressmen, congressional aides. Not one person in the room was a skeptic, and I was there, and I can confirm that. Right. Nobody was sitting there with their arms crossed, shaking their head, going, what a bunch of idiots these people are. I mean, it was electric.
Right, and I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do with the film Sirius. Oh, by the way, can you come to the premiere? I hope you can make it to the premiere.
I'm planning on it, yeah. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, great, because it's going to be at the LA Live premiere house there, the big one.